The massive auditorium stretched across 3 kilometers of polished crystal floors, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above. Representatives from 47 different species filled the curved seating arrangements, each delegation positioned according to their species' preferred atmospheric conditions and gravity requirements. The air itself was a carefully balanced mixture that could sustain most oxygen-breathing life forms, though many delegates wore breathing apparatus or environmental suits. Dr. Sarah Chun sat in the very back row, her simple gray jumpsuit making her nearly invisible among the elaborate ceremonial garments and exotic biological features of the other attendees. She had specifically requested this position when the human delegation was assigned their seating. While Ambassador Martinez and his team occupied the front section designated for newly recognized species, Sarah preferred the anonymity of the rear seats. From here, she could observe without being observed, listen without being heard, and, most importantly, leave without causing a diplomatic incident if needed. The current speaker stood at the central podium, a creature that defied easy description. Ambassador Vextar of the Kethmoran Collective was nearly 3 meters tall, with a body that seemed to flow like liquid metal between solid and semi-transparent states. Multiple appendages extended from its torso, each ending in delicate manipulator organs that gestured with practiced precision as it spoke. Its voice resonated through the chamber's translation systems, converting the subsonic rumbles of its native language into comprehensible speech for each species present. Honored colleagues, Vextar's translated voice carried an undertone of what humans might recognize as smugness. We gather today to address the integration protocols for our newest member species. As you are all aware, the humans of Sol 3 have recently achieved faster-than-light travel and have made contact with our galactic community. Sarah shifted slightly in her seat, activating her personal recording device with a subtle gesture. Everything said in this chamber was officially recorded, but she had learned long ago that official records and actual events didn't always align perfectly. Her enhanced memory implants were already cataloging every detail, from the micro-expressions of the various delegates to the specific word choices being used in translation. However, Vextar continued, its form rippling with what appeared to be satisfaction. We must consider the fundamental nature of this species before we proceed with full integration protocols. The humans represent a unique challenge to our established order. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Sarah noticed that several delegates in the predator species section leaned forward with obvious interest. The Kethmoran were known throughout the galaxy as master manipulators, capable of reading and exploiting the weaknesses of other species with surgical precision. They had built their civilization on the principle that intelligence was the ultimate predator trait, and that weaker species existed primarily to serve stronger ones. The humans, Vextar's voice took on a lecturing tone, represent what our xenobiological studies classify as a persistence predator species. This places them in a rather unusual category within our galactic community. The creature's appendages waved toward a holographic display that materialized above the podium. Images of various Earth animals appeared, alongside comparative data from other predator species in the galaxy. Most predator species in our community have evolved beyond their primitive hunting instincts through technological advancement and social development. The Zarathi, for example. Vextar gestured toward a section of the auditorium where massive, crystal carapace beings sat in specialized environmental pods, evolved from ambush predators, but now sustained themselves through photosynthetic processes and technological supplementation. Sarah found herself gripping the armrest of her chair more tightly than she had intended. She forced herself to relax, maintaining the passive expression she had perfected during her years as a xenoanthropologist. Her role here was officially as an observer and cultural consultant, but she was beginning to understand that this presentation was heading in a very specific direction. The Zephyrans Vextar continued, indicating a group of graceful, bird-like beings with iridescent feathers. Were once aerial hunters, but have transcended those limitations through genetic modification and symbiotic relationships with their ecosystem. The holographic display showed the evolution of various species from their predatory origins to their current, supposedly more civilized forms. However, humans present us with a species that has achieved technological advancement while retaining their fundamental predator nature almost completely intact. The display shifted to show various human activities: hunting, competitive sports, military exercises, and what appear to be footage from various conflicts throughout human history. Sarah's jaw tightened as she watched the carefully selected imagery. The presentation wasn't wrong, exactly, but it was presenting a deliberately skewed perspective. She could see how the selection of images and data points was designed to emphasize the most aggressive and competitive aspects of human behavior, while ignoring the cooperative and altruistic elements that were equally fundamental to human civilization. The implications of this are significant. Vextar's form seemed to expand slightly as it warmed to its subject. Humans demonstrate what our psychological profiles indicate is an unreformed predator mentality. They compete instinctively. They form hierarchical pack structures, and, most concerningly, they display what can only be described as an addiction to conflict and challenge. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft hum of environmental systems. Sarah could feel the attention of hundreds of alien minds focusing on the human delegation in the front rows. She was grateful for her position in the back, where the weight of that collective gaze couldn't reach her directly. Furthermore, Vextar's voice took on what the translation system rendered as an almost parental tone. Their psychological profiles indicate a dangerous tendency toward what they call heroism and sacrifice. These traits, while perhaps admirable in a primitive context, represent significant risk factors in a complex galactic civilization. A species that routinely produces individuals willing to die for abstract concepts like honor or justice is inherently unpredictable and potentially destabilizing. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach as she began to understand where this presentation was leading. The Kethmoran weren't just analyzing human nature. They were building a case. Every point was being carefully constructed to support a predetermined conclusion, and that conclusion was becoming increasingly obvious. Our xenopsychological assessments indicate that humans require extensive behavioral modification protocols before they can be safely integrated into galactic society, Vextar announced. We recommend a supervised integration period of no less than 500 standard years, during which human expansion beyond their home system would be restricted, and their technological development will be guided by appointed supervisory species. The reaction from the assembly was immediate and varied. Some species appeared shocked by the proposal, others seemed unsurprised, and a few were clearly pleased. Sarah noticed that most of the predator species representatives were nodding approvingly, while many of the herbivorous and omnivorous species seemed uncomfortable with the implications. Ambassador Martinez had risen from his seat in the front section, his face carefully neutral despite what Sarah knew must be considerable shock and anger. "Honored collective representative," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "Humanity appreciates the Galactic Council's concern for the welfare of all member species. However, we would like to request time to review these assessments and provide our own analysis of human psychological and social development." Vextar's form rippled in what might have been amusement. "Of course, Ambassador Martinez. However, we feel it is important to note that these assessments were conducted by teams of experts from multiple species over a period of several standard years. The data is quite comprehensive and has been thoroughly peer-reviewed by our most respected xenopsychological authorities." Sarah felt her hands clench in a fist despite her efforts to remain calm. The presentation was masterfully constructed, using legitimate psychological and anthropological concepts to build a case for what amounted to the permanent subjugation of humanity. The Kethmoran were known for this kind of manipulation, but experiencing it directly was different from reading about it in academic journals. What made it worse was that much of the basic data wasn't wrong. Humans were persistence predators, they did retain many competitive and hierarchical instincts, and they did have a tendency toward what other species might consider recklessly heroic behavior. But the interpretation of that data was being deliberately twisted to serve the Kethmoran's agenda. As the presentation continued, Sarah found herself analyzing not just what was being said, but how the other delegates were responding. The political dynamics of a chamber were becoming clearer with each passing moment. The Kethmoran had clearly been building support for this position for some time, and several other predator species were obviously prepared to support their conclusions. In addition to the psychological concerns, Vextar was saying, we must consider the technological implications of human integration. Their rapid advancement from primitive chemical rockets to faster-than-light travel in less than a century indicates a potentially dangerous instability in their technological development patterns. The holographic display shifted to show human technological progression, with particular emphasis on weapons development and military applications. Sarah noticed that civilian technological advances were barely mentioned, while every major military innovation was highlighted and analyzed in detail. This pattern of technological development, combined with their unreformed predator psychology, suggests that humans may represent a significant threat to galactic stability if allowed unrestricted development and expansion, Vextar concluded. We believe that careful supervision and gradual behavioral modification represents the most humane approach to ensuring both human welfare and galactic security. As the presentation moved toward its conclusion, Sarah made her decision. She had heard enough to understand exactly what was happening here, and she needed to act before the vote was called. The Kethmoran were building toward a formal recommendation that would effectively make humanity a protectorate species, subject to the control and supervision of supposedly more advanced civilizations. She quietly gathered her datapad and personal recording equipment, moving with the practiced stealth that had served her well during her years of fieldwork among various alien species. Her enhanced reflexes and spatial awareness, products of the same evolutionary history that Vextar was using to condemn humanity, now allowed her to move through the chamber without attracting attention. As she reached the exit, Sarah could hear Vextar beginning to outline the specific terms of the proposed supervision protocols. She paused just long enough to hear the creature announce that the Kethmoran Collective would be honored to serve as primary supervisors for human development, supported by several other predator species who had experience in guiding less developed civilizations. Sarah slipped through the exit doors as quietly as she had planned, her mind already racing through the implications of what she had just witnessed. The Galactic Council was about to vote on whether humanity would be allowed to develop as a free species or would be placed under the permanent control of alien overseers. And, based on the reaction she had observed in the chamber, the vote was likely to go against humanity unless something changed dramatically. As the door sealed behind her, cutting off the sound of Vextar's ongoing presentation, Sarah activated her personal communicator. She had work to do, and very little time to do it. The fate of human independence hung in the balance, and she was quite possibly the only person in position to do something about it. The human embassy complex occupied a modest section of the diplomatic quarter on Nexus Prime, the neutral space station that served as the Galactic Council's headquarters. Sarah moved through the corridors with purposeful urgency, her security clearance allowing her access to areas that most visitors never saw. The artificial gravity generators created a comfortable Earth-normal environment, but Sarah barely noticed the familiar sensation as her mind raced through possibilities and contingencies. She reached her private office within minutes of leaving the council chamber, immediately sealing the door and activating privacy shields that would prevent any form of electronic surveillance. Her fingers flew across the holographic interface of her primary computer system, opening secure communication channels that bypassed the normal diplomatic networks entirely. Computer, initiate emergency protocol 7 Alpha 7, Sarah commanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Authorization, Chun, Sarah, Xenoanthropologist Specialist, clearance level 9. The system responded immediately, recognizing both her voice pattern and the biometric signature from her enhanced neural interfaces. A series of encrypted communication channels opened simultaneously, connecting her to Earth, the human research station at Proxima Centauri, and 3 deep space exploration vessels currently operating beyond the galactic frontier. Dr. Chun, came the immediate response from Earth Central Command. We're receiving your emergency beacon. What's your status? General Morrison, Sarah replied, recognizing the voice of the head of Earth's Military Space Command. I need to speak with Director Hayes and the entire Emergency Council immediately. We have a Category 1 diplomatic crisis developing, and we have less than 6 hours to respond. Stand by, Doctor. Connecting you now to the full council session. Within moments, Sarah found herself looking at a holographic conference table surrounded by some of the most powerful people in human space. Director Rebecca Hayes of Earth Central Government sat at the head of the table, flanked by General Morrison, Admiral Chun, no relation, despite the shared surname, Chief Science Officer Dr. Patel, and several other key figures in human leadership. Sarah, Director Hayes said without preamble, we're reading elevated stress indicators from your biosignature. What's happening at the council session? Sarah took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. Ma'am, the Keth Moran Collective has just presented what amounts to a formal case for placing humanity under permanent galactic supervision. They're characterizing us as an unreformed predator species and arguing that we represent a threat to galactic stability unless we undergo extensive behavioral modification. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah could see the implications registering on the faces around the virtual table. Admiral Chun was the first to speak. What kind of timeline are we looking at for a decision? The formal vote is scheduled for 6 hours from now, Sarah replied. The Keth Moran presentation was designed to build momentum for an immediate decision. They don't want to give us time to mount an effective response. General Morrison leaned forward. What's your assessment of their support base? Sarah called up her observational data on her secondary display. Based on delegate reactions, I estimate they have solid support from at least 15 species, probable support from another 8 to 10, and strong opposition from maybe 6 species. The remainder are either uncommitted or I couldn't read their positions clearly. That's nowhere near enough to stop the vote, Dr. Patel observed grimly. The Galactic Council requires a 2/3 majority for species restriction protocols, but with 47 species represented, they only need 32 votes to implement supervision measures. Director Hayes drummed her fingers on the table, a habit Sarah recognized from their previous interactions. What are our options? Can Ambassador Martinez buy us more time? I doubt it, Sarah replied. The Keth Moran have been building this case for months, possibly years. They're not going to allow us to delay when they think they have the votes to win. Then, we need to change the game, Admiral Chun said quietly. Sarah, you know these species better than anyone else on our team. Is there anything in their presentation that we can challenge directly? Sarah pulled up the data she had recorded during Vextar's speech. Their psychological analysis isn't technically wrong, but it's incomplete and deliberately misleading. They're presenting our competitive and hierarchical instincts as uniquely dangerous while ignoring similar traits in other species. More importantly, they're completely dismissing our cooperative and altruistic behaviors, which are just as fundamental to human psychology. Can we present counter-evidence? Director Hayes asked. Maybe, but not in the time we have available. And even if we could, the Keth Moran have had years to prepare their case. They've got peer-reviewed studies from multiple xenopsychological authorities. We'd be arguing against established academic consensus. General Morrison stood and began pacing, which translated oddly in the holographic environment. What about our technological development? They're characterizing our rapid advancement as dangerous instability. Again, they're not wrong about the facts, just the interpretation, Sarah explained. Human technological development has been remarkably rapid by galactic standards. Most species take millennia to advance from chemical rockets to faster-than-light travel. We did it in less than a century. From their perspective, that looks like dangerous volatility. But It's also our greatest strength, Dr. Patel interjected. Our adaptability and innovation rate are what allowed us to survive and thrive on Earth, and they're what will make us valuable members of galactic civilization. Sarah felt something click in her mind as Dr. Patel spoke. That's it, she said suddenly. We're approaching this wrong. We can't defend against their characterization because it's based on legitimate observations. But we can reframe the entire discussion. Explain, Director Hayes commanded. Sarah stood and began pacing in her own office, her enhanced neural processors working at maximum capacity. The Keth Moran are presenting our traits as dangerous because they assume that galactic civilization represents the pinnacle of social and technological development. They're arguing that we need to be civilized according to their standards. And Admiral Chin prompted. And they're wrong about what civilization actually requires, Sarah continued, her excitement growing as the idea developed. Every major crisis in galactic history has been solved through innovation and adaptation, not through conformity to established patterns. The Void War, the Crystalline Plague, the Great Dark Matter Instability, all of those were resolved by species that broke conventional thinking patterns. General Morrison stopped pacing. You're saying our dangerous traits are actually assets. Exactly. But more than that, I'm saying that the galaxy needs species like us. The Keth Moran and their allies represent a status quo that's been stable for thousands of years. But stability isn't the same thing as strength. They've created a civilization that's incredibly good at maintaining itself, but terrible at adapting to new challenges. Director Hayes leaned forward. Can you prove that? Sarah was already pulling up galactic historical data. I think so. Give me a few hours to compile the evidence, and I can show that every major advancement in galactic civilization in the last 5,000 years has come from species that retained exactly the kinds of traits the Keth Moran are trying to suppress. You don't have a few hours, Admiral Chin reminded her. The vote is in 6 hours, and you'll need time to present whatever case you can build. Then, I'll need help, Sarah said. She activated her personal AI assistant, a sophisticated program that had been designed specifically for xenoanthropological research. Arya, I need you to cross-reference galactic historical records with species psychological profiles. Look for correlations between retained predator traits and innovation rates, crisis response effectiveness, and technological advancement speed. Working, Dr. Chun, the AI responded. Initial analysis indicates significant positive correlations across multiple datasets. Estimated completion time for comprehensive analysis, 4.7 hours. Too long, Sarah muttered. Arya, prioritize the most dramatic examples. I need proof of concept, not comprehensive analysis. Understood. Adjusting parameters. Estimated completion time for preliminary analysis, 1.3 hours. Director Hayes stood. Sarah, you have our full authorization to present any case you can build. Admiral Chun, I want our entire diplomatic staff working on vote counting and delegate outreach. General Morrison, prepare contingency plans in case this vote goes against us. Ma'am, General Morrison said carefully, what kind of contingency plans? All kinds, General. If the galaxy wants to treat us as a dangerous predator species, maybe it's time they remembered why predators are dangerous. The conference ended, leaving Sarah alone with her racing thoughts and the daunting task ahead of her. She had less than 5 hours to build a case that could reshape how the galaxy viewed not just humanity, but the entire concept of civilization itself. She activated her office's enhanced processing systems and began pulling data from every source available to her. Galactic historical records, species psychological profiles, technological development patterns, crisis response analyses, and innovation metrics all flowed across her screens in a complex web of information. As she worked, Sarah found herself thinking about the irony of her situation. The very traits that Vextar had identified as dangerous, human persistence, competitiveness, and willingness to take risks, were exactly what she was going to need to pull off this challenge. She was about to attempt something that no other species would even consider, challenging the fundamental assumptions of an entire galactic civilization with less than a day's preparation. It was by any reasonable standard impossible, but humans have been doing impossible things for most of their history. It was, Sarah reflected as she dove deeper into her research, exactly what made them human. Sarah's enhanced neural implants processed data at a rate that would have been impossible for an unaugmented human mind. Streams of information flowed across multiple displays as her AI assistant compiled correlation matrices, historical analyses, and psychological profiles from across the galaxy. The pattern that emerged was both clear and damning for the Kethmoran position. Arya, display the crisis response correlation chart, Sarah commanded as she reviewed her findings. The holographic projection filled her office with a three-dimensional web of data points, each representing a major galactic crisis over the past 10,000 years. Color-coded lines connected the crises to the species that had provided solutions, with intensity indicating the degree of contribution to the resolution. As you can see, Dr. Chun, Arya's synthesized voice explained, species with higher retention of predator psychology traits show dramatically higher crisis innovation rates. The correlation coefficient is 0.87, which indicates an extremely strong positive relationship. Sarah studied the data with growing excitement. The pattern was undeniable. The Zarathi, who Vextar had praised for transcending their predator origins, had contributed exactly 0 major innovations in the past 3,000 years. The Kethmoran themselves, despite their technological sophistication, had never developed a single breakthrough technology that hadn't been adapted from the work of other species. "Show me the Void War analysis," Sarah requested. The display shifted to focus on the galaxy's most devastating crisis, a conflict that had threatened to tear apart the fabric of space-time itself nearly 2,000 years ago. The solution had come from an unlikely alliance between the Drachmer, a species of pack hunters, and the Solani, who had evolved from pursuit predators similar to Earth's big cats. The conventional narrative, Arya continued, credits the resolution to the combined technological resources of the entire galactic alliance. However, detailed analysis shows that the critical breakthrough came from Drachma persistence hunting techniques adapted to track quantum fluctuations, combined with Solani tactical thinking patterns that allowed them to predict void entity movement patterns. Sarah felt a surge of vindication. The galaxy's greatest victory had been achieved not through the civilized cooperation that species like the Kethmoran promoted, but through the application of supposedly primitive predator instincts to an unprecedented problem. Cross-reference with the crystalline plague resolution, Sarah ordered. The data shifted again, showing another crisis where conventional galactic thinking had failed completely. The crystalline plague had been a silicon-based life form that could convert organic matter into more crystalline structures, spreading through space with terrifying efficiency. The cure had come from the Kythera, a species of ambush predators who had retained their ability to think in terms of patient, long-term stalking strategies. The Kythera solution involved a multi-generational campaign of strategic containment and gradual adaptation, Arya reported. Their predator patience allowed them to implement a plan that required over 300 years to complete, something that no other species was psychologically capable of sustaining. Sarah was beginning to see the full scope of the argument she could make. Every major galactic crisis had been resolved through the application of what the Kethmoran classified as primitive, dangerous thinking patterns. The galaxy's most stable and civilized species were also its most stagnant and least innovative. Arya, compile a list of all major technological breakthroughs in the past 5,000 years. Cross-reference with species predator trait retention indices. The results were even more dramatic than Sarah had hoped. Species that had retained significant portions of their predator psychology were responsible for 87% of all major innovations, despite representing less than 20% of galactic civilization. Display the Kethmoran innovation record, Sarah said with growing confidence. The projection showed a species that had achieved remarkable technological sophistication through the systematic acquisition and refinement of innovations developed by others. They were masters of optimization and efficiency, but they had never created anything genuinely new. Their entire civilization was built on the foundation of other species' breakthroughs. Sarah leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. The Kethmoran weren't trying to protect galactic civilization from dangerous predator species. They were trying to protect their own position as the galaxy's dominant manipulator species by eliminating the competition. Humanity represented a threat not because humans were dangerous, but because they were innovative. Arya, project human innovation potential based on current development patterns. The AI's analysis was sobering in its implications. Based on current human technological advancement rates and psychological profile analysis, humans show potential for major breakthrough innovation at approximately 50 times the galactic average. Their combination of persistence, hunting psychology, pack cooperation instincts, and risk-taking behaviors creates optimal conditions for revolutionary thinking. No wonder the Kethmoran were afraid. Sarah activated her communication system and opened a channel to Ambassador Martinez. Ambassador, I need an emergency meeting with you and your entire staff. I have information that could change everything. Dr. Chun, Martinez's voice came back immediately. We're in the middle of damage control efforts. Can this wait? No, sir, it cannot. I have evidence that the Kethmoran presentation was not just biased. It was deliberately fraudulent. And I think I know how to prove it to the council. There was a pause before Martinez responded. I'll clear my schedule. How soon can you be here? 5 minutes. Sarah gathered her data files and headed for the ambassador's office, her mind already working on the presentation strategy. She had the evidence to prove her case, but evidence alone wouldn't be enough. She needed to present it in a way that would resonate with the diverse psychology of the Galactic Assembly. Ambassador Martinez's office was in chaos when Sarah arrived. Diplomatic staff members were working frantically at communication stations, trying to reach undecided delegates and shore up support for humanity's position. The atmosphere was one of barely controlled panic. Dr. Chun, Martinez stood as she entered. Please tell me you have good news. Sarah activated her portable holographic projector and began displaying her compiled data. I have better than good news, Ambassador. I have proof that the entire foundation of the Kethmoran argument is not just wrong, but deliberately misleading. The diplomatic staff gathered around as Sarah began her presentation. She showed them the crisis response correlations, the innovation indices, and the clear pattern of predator species driving galactic progress while more civilized species stagnated. This is incredible work, Dr. Chen, Martinez said when she finished, but how do we present this to the council? We have less than 3 hours before the vote. I want to request a formal rebuttal period, Sarah replied. The council rules allow for species to present counterarguments before a vote is taken. I can present this data directly to the assembly. The Kethmoran will never allow it, one of the staff members protested. They'll argue that the evidence is too complex to review properly in the time available. Sarah smiled, feeling the predator instincts that Vextar had condemned rising to the surface. Then, we'll make it impossible for them to refuse. Ambassador, I need you to formally request the rebuttal period, but don't mention what evidence I'm planning to present. What are you planning, Dr. Chun? Martinez asked warily. I'm planning to turn their own argument against them, Sarah replied. They've spent months building a case that predator psychology is dangerous to galactic civilization. I'm going to prove that it's actually essential for galactic survival. She began outlining her strategy, showing how each element of the Kethmoran presentation could be reframed to support the opposite conclusion. Their careful selection of data points could be countered by an even more careful selection that told the complete story. Their expert testimonies could be challenged by pointing out the systematic bias in the expert selection process. Most importantly, Sarah concluded, I'm going to put them in a position where opposing my evidence means opposing their own methodology. They can't claim that my data is invalid without admitting that their data is equally questionable. Martinez was nodding slowly. It's risky. If it fails, we'll have burned our bridges with some of the most powerful species in the galaxy. If we don't try, Sarah replied, humanity becomes a protectorate species for the next 500 years, assuming we're allowed to survive that long. The Keth Moran don't just want to control us, Ambassador. They want to eliminate us as a threat to their position. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Finally, Martinez activated his communication system. Council Secretariat, this is Ambassador Martinez requesting a formal rebuttal period under Article 7 of the Species Integration Protocols. Stand by, Ambassador, came the reply. After a few minutes, the voice returned. Ambassador Martinez, your request has been reviewed. You are granted 30 minutes for rebuttal presentation to begin immediately before the formal vote. Please be advised that this will be your only opportunity to present counter-evidence. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. 30 minutes to overturn months of careful manipulation and political maneuvering. It was an impossible challenge by any rational standard. But then, humans specialized in impossible challenges. The council chamber felt different when Sarah returned. Where before she had been an anonymous observer in the back row, now she walked purposefully down the central aisle toward the speaking podium, carrying the weight of humanity's future on her shoulders. Every eye in the vast auditorium tracked her movement, and she could feel the mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and hostility radiating from the assembled delegates. Ambassador Vextar remained at the podium as Sarah approached, its liquid metal form rippling with what might have been annoyance. The Keth Moran had clearly expected their presentation to be followed immediately by a vote, not by a human counterargument. Honored delegates, Sarah began as she activated the chamber's holographic systems, her voice carrying clearly through the translation network. I come before you not to dispute the fact presented by Ambassador Vextar, but to question the interpretation of those facts and the conclusions drawn from them. Her first holographic display materialized above the podium, showing the same basic data that Vextar had presented about human psychology and development patterns. Several delegates shifted restlessly, clearly expecting her to simply rehash arguments they had already heard. Ambassador Vextar has accurately described humanity as a persistence predator species that has retained many of our ancestral hunting and competitive instincts, Sarah continued. This characterization is correct. However, the ambassador's analysis of what this means for galactic civilization is not only incorrect, it is dangerously misleading. The display shifted to show her crisis response correlation data. A murmur ran through the assembly as delegates began to recognize the implications of what they were seeing. For the past 10,000 years, Sarah announced, every major crisis that has threatened galactic civilization has been resolved through the application of what Ambassador Vextar characterizes as primitive and dangerous predator psychology traits. She highlighted the Void War analysis, showing how Drachma persistence hunting techniques have been essential to tracking the quantum entities that conventional sensors couldn't detect. The Solani tactical thinking, derived from pack hunting strategies, have been crucial for predicting enemy movement patterns. The crystalline plague, Sarah continued, advancing to the next display, was stopped by the Kythera through the application of ambush predator patience and long-term strategic thinking. No other species was psychologically capable of implementing a plan that required 3 centuries to complete. Ambassador Vextar's form was visibly agitated now, its surface rippling with rapid fluctuations. Dr. Chen, it interjected, these are selective examples that ignore the broader context of galactic development. Sarah smiled, recognizing the opening she had been hoping for. You're absolutely correct, Ambassador. Let me provide the broader context. Her display exploded into a comprehensive view of galactic innovation patterns, showing technological advancement rates correlated with predator trait retention across all 47 member species. The pattern was undeniable. Species with higher predator psychology scores were responsible for the vast majority of breakthrough innovations. In the past 5,000 years, Sarah announced, species classified as having significant predator trait retention have contributed 87% of all major technological breakthroughs, despite representing less than 20% of galactic civilization. She could see the impact of this revelation rippling through the assembly. Delegates were activating their personal data systems, cross-referencing her claims with their own records. The mathematical correlation was too strong to dispute. Furthermore, Sarah continued, pressing her advantage, species that have undergone the kind of behavioral modification that Ambassador Vextar recommends show a dramatic decline in innovation capacity. The Zarathi, whom the ambassador praised for transcending their predator origins, have contributed zero major innovations in the past 3,000 years. The Zarathi delegation's crystalline forms shifted uncomfortably in their environmental pods. Sarah felt a brief moment of sympathy for them, but the stakes were too high for diplomatic nicety. The implications of this pattern are clear, Sarah stated. The galaxy doesn't need protection from predator psychology traits. The galaxy depends on them for its continued survival and advancement. She advanced to her next display, showing population projections and innovation requirements. Current galactic demographic trends show a steady decline in the percentage of species retaining significant predator traits. If this trend continues, and if existing predator species undergo the behavioral modification that Ambassador Vextar recommends, the galaxy will face an innovation crisis within the next millennium. Ambassador Vextar's agitation had reached the point where its form was barely maintaining cohesion. This analysis ignores the stability benefits of behavioral modification. It protested. Predator species may be innovative, but they are also unpredictable and potentially violent. Sarah had been waiting for exactly this objection. Let's examine that claim, Ambassador. Her display shifted to show conflict statistics across galactic history. The data told a story that directly contradicted conventional wisdom. Species with retained predator traits are actually less likely to engage in large-scale conflicts than species that have undergone behavioral modification, Sarah announced. Predator psychology includes strong pack cooperation instincts and sophisticated threat assessment capabilities. Species with these traits are more likely to resolve disputes through negotiation and less likely to initiate conflicts they cannot win. She highlighted specific examples. The Drachmer had not initiated a conflict in over 2,000 years, preferring diplomatic solutions that allowed them to focus on exploration and research. The Solani had actually served as mediators in several interspecies disputes, their tactical thinking making them excellent at finding mutually beneficial solutions. In contrast, Sarah continued, species that have undergone extensive behavioral modification show higher rates of systemic aggression and territorial disputes. The modification process appears to eliminate not just predator instincts, but also the natural caution and cooperative behaviors that evolved alongside them. The chamber had fallen silent, except for the hum of environmental systems and the soft sounds of delegates accessing their personal data networks to verify Sarah's claims. She could see the mood of the assembly shifting as the implications of her analysis became clear. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah said, advancing to her final set of displays, we must consider what humanity specifically brings to galactic civilization. The holographic projection showed human technological development patterns alongside projected innovation curves based on current human psychology and development rates. The numbers were staggering. Human innovation potential, based on current development patterns and psychological analysis, exceeds galactic average by a factor of 50, Sarah announced. Our combination of persistence, hunting psychology, pack cooperation instincts, and calculated risk-taking behaviors creates optimal conditions for breakthrough thinking. She displayed specific examples of recent human innovations that had already impressed galactic observers. Faster-than-light communication protocols that improved on existing systems by orders of magnitude, resource extraction techniques that were both more efficient and less environmentally destructive, and social organization models that had successfully managed the transition from single-planet to multi-system civilization in record time. The question before this assembly is not whether humanity should be allowed to develop freely, Sarah concluded. The question is whether galactic civilization can afford to suppress the kind of innovative thinking that has consistently proven essential for our collective survival. She paused, letting the weight of her argument settle over the assembly before delivering her final point. Ambassador Vextar has characterized human predator psychology as a threat to galactic civilization. I submit to you that it is exactly the opposite. Humanity represents exactly the kind of innovative, adaptive thinking that has repeatedly saved galactic civilization from destruction. Suppressing these traits doesn't make the galaxy safer. It makes the galaxy more vulnerable to the next crisis that conventional thinking cannot solve. Sarah deactivated her holographic displays and stepped back from the podium. The chamber remained silent for long moments as delegates processed what they had heard. She had presented her evidence, made her argument, and turned the Kethmoran logic against itself. Now she could only wait for the galaxy to decide whether humanity would be allowed to remain free. Ambassador Vextar had regained some composure, its form stabilizing as it prepared a response. But Sarah could see uncertainty in its movements now, the confidence of earlier shaken by the comprehensive nature of her counterargument. Dr. Chen raises interesting points, Vextar said carefully, but correlation does not necessarily imply causation. The relationship between predator traits and innovation could be explained by other factors. Sarah stepped forward again. Then, I would be happy to submit my complete data analysis for peer review by any xenopsychological authorities the Council cares to designate. But I would also point out that Ambassador Vextar's original presentation suffered from the same potential methodological issues he now raises about my analysis. The trap was sprung. Vextar couldn't challenge Sarah's methodology without undermining the foundation of the Kethmoran case. The chamber buzzed with the sound of delegates discussing the implications in their various languages and communication methods. Sarah remained at the podium, waiting for the Council's decision. She had done everything possible with the time and resources available to her. Now humanity's fate rested in the hands of beings whose psychology and motivations she could only partially understand. But as she looked out over the assembly, Sarah felt a quiet confidence growing within her. She had used the very traits that Vextar condemned to build her case. Human persistence in gathering and analyzing massive amounts of data under extreme time pressure, competitive instincts that drove her to find weaknesses in the opposition's arguments, and the calculated risk-taking that had led her to challenge the foundational assumptions of galactic civilization itself. Whether she won or lost, she had proven the Kethmoran wrong about the value of human nature. The voting chamber configuration shifted as the Galactic Council prepared for the formal decision. Delegate stations rose from the floor in a complex pattern that allowed each species to cast their vote privately while still maintaining visual contact with the assembly. The massive display screens around the chamber showed the current tally as each vote was registered, though the individual votes remained anonymous until the final count was revealed. Sarah remained at the podium as the voting process began, watching the numbers climb with carefully controlled anxiety. Ambassador Martinez had taken position in the human delegation area, his face a mask of diplomatic neutrality that couldn't quite hide the tension underneath. The Kethmoran delegation clustered around Vextar, their forms rippling with agitation as they tracked the unexpected developments. The motion before the Council, announced the Chamber's ceremonial voice, is to implement supervision protocol for the human species pending behavioral modification assessment. A vote of yes supports implementation of supervision. A vote of no opposes supervision and supports standard integration protocols. The first votes appeared on the display almost immediately. The Kethmoran voted yes, as expected, followed quickly by several of their known allies among the predator species that had undergone extensive behavioral modification. But, as Sarah watched, she began to see votes that surprised her. The Zarathi delegation voted no. It was the first indication that her presentation had achieved something beyond simply making her case. The Zarathi had been specifically mentioned in Vextar's presentation as an example of successful behavioral modification. Yet they were now voting against applying the same process to humanity. More votes appeared on the display. The Drachmer voted no, followed by the Solani. Both species had been highlighted in Sarah's presentation as examples of predator psychology contributing to galactic welfare, and both were now rejecting the premise that such psychology was dangerous. But the real surprise came when several of the traditional herbivorous species also began voting no. The Valdari, peaceful plant-based beings who had previously supported Kethmoran positions, almost automatically cast their vote against supervision. The Centran Collective, a hive mind species known for their cautious approach to galactic politics, also voted no. 37 votes have been cast, the Chamber's voice announced. Final votes are now being registered. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as the last votes appeared on the display. The margin was closer than she had dared hope, but the trend was clear. When the final tally appeared, the chamber fell completely silent. Final vote count: 16 votes in favor of supervision protocols, 31 votes opposed. The motion fails to achieve the required two-thirds majority and is therefore rejected. The sound that erupted from the human delegation area was somewhere between a cheer and a sigh of relief. Sarah felt her knees go weak with the sudden release of tension, but she remained standing as the implications of the vote sank in throughout the chamber. "Dr. Chun," came a voice from the assembly floor. Sarah looked up to see Ambassador Thekvar of the Zarathi delegation rising from their environmental pod. "Would you be willing to elaborate on your innovation projections? My species would be interested in collaborating with humanity on research initiatives." Before Sarah could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "The Drachmer Exploration Consortium would also like to discuss joint ventures," announced Captain Vorth, the massive pack leader whose scarred hide told the story of decades spent exploring the galaxy's most dangerous regions. "Human persistence hunting psychology could be valuable for our deep space survey missions." What followed was unprecedented in Galactic Council history. Instead of the usual formal adjournment, the chamber erupted into an impromptu networking session as species representatives approached the human delegation with proposals for cooperation, research partnerships, and technology exchanges. Sarah found herself surrounded by xenobiologists, exploration captains, and research coordinators, all eager to discuss the implications of her presentation. The Solani wanted to compare human tactical thinking with their own strategic approaches. The Kithira were interested in human long-term planning capabilities. Even some of the modified species were asking about the possibility of recovering their own predator traits through genetic therapy. Dr. Chun, Ambassador Vextar's voice cut through the conversations around her. The Kethmoran had approached the podium, its form now rigidly controlled but clearly agitated. "Your presentation was impressive. However, I believe there are aspects of human psychology that you have not fully considered." Sarah turned to face the being that had nearly succeeded in condemning humanity to centuries of subjugation. "Such as your species' tendency toward individual heroism and self-sacrifice," Vextar replied. "These traits may seem admirable, but they represent a fundamental instability in social organization. A species that produces individuals willing to die for abstract concepts is inherently unpredictable." Sarah studied the Kethmoran carefully, noting the subtle signs of stress in its form fluctuations. This wasn't just academic debate anymore. Vextar was genuinely concerned about something beyond simple political maneuvering. "Ambassador," Sarah said slowly, "what exactly are you afraid of?" Vextar's form rippled with what might have been surprise at the directness of the question. For several moments, the creature seemed to struggle with its response. "The Kethmoran have maintained galactic stability for over 3,000 years, it finally said. "We have prevented wars, mediated conflicts, and ensured peaceful cooperation between species with radically different psychologies and needs. This has required careful management of innovation and change to prevent destabilizing developments." The truth began to crystallize in Sarah's mind. You're not afraid that humans are dangerous. You're afraid that we'll upset the balance of power you've spent millennia establishing. Stability requires predictability, Vextar replied. Your species represents a variable that cannot be easily controlled or predicted. Your innovation rate alone could destabilize established technological hierarchies. Your willingness to sacrifice for abstract principles could undermine carefully negotiated political arrangements. Sarah felt a mixture of understanding and disgust. The Kethmoran hadn't been trying to protect galactic civilization from humanity. They had been trying to protect their own position as galactic managers from the threat of human unpredictability. Ambassador, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics, you've just admitted that your entire case was built on protecting Kethmoran political interests, not galactic welfare. The chamber, which had been buzzing with multiple conversations, suddenly fell silent. Every delegate turned to focus on the confrontation between the human xenoanthropologist and the Kethmoran ambassador. Vextar's form began fluctuating rapidly, cycling between different states of matter as its emotional control slipped. The distinction is irrelevant. Kethmoran interests and galactic stability are synonymous. We have maintained peace and prosperity for millennia. You've maintained stagnation and control, Sarah replied. Your peace and prosperity have come at the cost of innovation and growth. You've created a galaxy that's stable but unable to adapt to new challenges. She gestured toward the assembled delegates. Look around this chamber. Every species that voted against human supervision did so because they recognized that their own survival depends on the kind of innovation that predator psychology produces. They voted for their future, not for your stability. The silence in the chamber was profound. Sarah could see the implications of her words sinking in among the various delegations. The vote hadn't just been about humanity's freedom. It had been about the future direction of galactic civilization itself. Dr. Chun, came a new voice from the assembly. Sarah looked up to see Coordinator Synth of the Centran Collective, their massive compound eyes reflecting the chamber's lighting as they spoke. Your analysis suggests that galactic civilization requires a higher percentage of species with retained predator traits for optimal innovation and crisis response. Do you have recommendations for achieving this balance? Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. The question was about far more than academic research or policy recommendations. The assembled delegates were asking her to help reshape the fundamental structure of galactic civilization. Coordinator Synth, she replied, I believe the galaxy needs to embrace diversity of thinking rather than conformity to established patterns. Species should be encouraged to retain their unique psychological traits while developing the technological and social capabilities needed for interstellar cooperation. She paused, looking out over the assembly. The Kethmoran model of civilization assumes that stability requires uniformity. I propose that true stability requires adaptability, and adaptability requires diversity. The galaxy is facing an unknown future filled with challenges we cannot yet imagine. Our best hope for survival is to maintain the full spectrum of psychological and technological approaches that evolution has provided. As Sarah finished speaking, she realized that something fundamental had changed in the chamber. The delegates were no longer looking at her as a representative of a single species pleading for acceptance. They were looking at her as a voice for a new vision of what galactic civilization could become. The vote to accept or reject human supervision had become something much larger. It had become a choice between the managed stability of the past and the uncertain innovation of the future. And the galaxy had chosen innovation. As the formal session concluded and delegates began filing out of the chamber, Sarah remained at the podium for a few more moments, processing what had just occurred. She had come to the council as an observer, slipped away to avoid a predetermined conclusion, and ended up helping to reshape the philosophical foundations of galactic civilization. It was, she reflected, exactly the kind of impossible outcome that human persistence and adaptability made possible. Ambassador Vextar had been right about one thing. Humans were inherently unpredictable. But that wasn't a weakness to be corrected. It was a strength to be celebrated. As she finally left the podium and headed toward the human delegation area, Sarah found herself smiling. The galaxy was about to become a much more interesting place.